Every year is really different, and it's different for the tomatoes, and this year is more different than most. This has been a very long, late spring, or maybe even a late winter, we could call it. It's still very cold. If you're a tomato, you think temperatures in the 40s or even the high 30s that we've been having at night is just torture. And it is for them. Tomatoes are a warm weather crop. You never see them around here during the winter, even though they're a perennial plant that can survive year after year in the tropics. Here they're killed every year at the end of the growing season by a combination of cold weather and diseases that strike them. So these little guys are going to live for a season and give us lots of tomatoes, and then they're going to be part of the great compost pile in the sky. Tomatoes are really fascinating plants, as are many of their kin. These are New World plants, Western Hemisphere plants originally from somewhere in South America, probably Amazonia, that made their way through trade up into Mexico and were perfected as an edible in Mexico by the Mexican farmers millennia ago. And became different varieties of edible tomatoes back then, and didn't make it to the so-called Old World until the Spanish and Portuguese colonized, and the trade routes took things from Mexico basically across the Pacific to the Philippines, and then into Asia, and then around the bottom of Africa, and eventually to Europe. And tomatoes, as well as peppers and potatoes and corn, were the great New World vegetables that eventually made it over to Asia, Africa, and Europe, and revolutionized food production in all of those areas. As a result, tomatoes have developed or been developed by humans to grow in a lot of different situations, a lot of different climates, and a lot of different lengths of season. And over the years, gardeners and people who sell plants to gardeners have learned which ones work in a given area and which ones don't as well. So I can pass along to you some sort of accumulated knowledge about what people's experiences have been growing tomatoes in the Bay Area. Tomatoes are relatively close cousins of potatoes, and they're distant cousins of peppers and even tobacco. They're members of the Solanaceae, the nightshade family. They're subject to a lot of the same diseases that potatoes and tobacco are subject to. And as a result, you never want to grow tomatoes where you have grown potatoes previously, or vice versa. And you don't want to smoke around tomatoes. Tobacco mosaic virus is very, very contagious, and is in the tobacco of cigarettes, and can spread very easily to tomatoes and be very devastating to them. So keep your smoking away from the tomatoes. They're also cousins of petunias and million bells, calibrachoa. but it's not a problem to grow them near petunias. Their wild ancestors are really unknown. Somewhere down there in Central South America, and no longer in existence, apparently. No one's been able to find a living progenitor to the tomatoes that we have today. Now, if this were a live presentation with an audience, I would ask you, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? And we have a lively discussion of that. And I'm sorry that we can't have a lively discussion here on Zoom, but I will answer the question for you anyway. The answer is yes. And the answer is yes because botanically it's a fruit. And there's no argument about that. It's a fruit because it's simply the swollen ovary of the flower, designed to envelop and protect the seeds that are inside, and designed to be eaten by an animal that will then digest and process the seeds and excrete them some distance from the plant where they were found with some fertilizer, so that they can grow again. They're a vegetable because the US Supreme Court says they're a vegetable. And believe it or not, back in the early 1900s, the Supreme Court had to decide that question. It was a question of import taxes and whether imported tomatoes were a fruit or a vegetable, taxed if fruit, non-taxed if vegetable. And they made the very wise decision that, well, in most of our minds, it's a vegetable. We treat it like a vegetable. We cook it like a vegetable. We don't eat it for dessert. It must be a vegetable. That must be what the legislators were thinking when they wrote the tax code. So yes, it's a fruit, and yes, it's a vegetable. It's a fruit very similar to a pepper or to a zucchini. They all have the same purpose of making something palatable around the seeds so that somebody will eat them. In the case of peppers, we think they were designed for birds to eat, and that they were hot so that mammals wouldn't eat them and crunch the relatively delicate seeds. In the case of tomatoes, it was probably something bigger, a mammal of some sort. But if you've ever de-seeded a tomato, you know that there's that slimy stuff all over the seeds. They're slippery, and if you try to chew them, it's really difficult. They just sort of slide down and you swallow them. And that might be the mechanism that the tomatoes developed to avoid the seeds getting crushed by, if a bear ate it, for instance. It might chew it a little bit, but then it would just swallow it, spread it around. There are a lot of words associated with tomatoes that are confusing, so I want to go through a few sort of basic concepts. Probably the most important for Bay Area gardeners is days to ripen. Days to ripen, you'll see on a tag on a typical tomato. This is a bush early girl, and I don't know that I'm going to ask you, Jen, to get close enough to be able to read this, so I'm going to try to read it. I think it says it's about 70 days to ripen, but the print's too small for me to read. If the tag says 70 days or 80 days or 85 days or 53 days, in the case of early girl, I think they claim 53 days. What that means is that from putting a seedling like this into the ground, you should expect fruit in 70 days, 53 days, whatever it is. Now that is assuming that you have perfect tomato circumstances, which means days that are between about 70 and 85 degrees and nights that are warmer than 55 degrees. And any of you whose brains are rolling around in your head right now saying, is that us? The answer is no, that's not us. We generally have nights that are closer to 50 degrees, even in the summer. And we often have days that are hotter than 85 degrees. And so our weather is not perfect for tomatoes anywhere in the Bay Area. And that means that it slows down the ripening, and that a tomato that says 70 days on it on the tag is likely to be closer to 80 or 85 days in real life. And a tomato that says 85 days will be many more than that. And so if you get a plant for a better boy or a big boy, one of the giant tomatoes, beefsteak,
Black cran.
they are going to take a long time to ripen. So we'll be talking about varieties that are likely to ripen a little quicker for you here and be more successful. The reason why it's difficult to grow the long ripening tomatoes is that the longer the tomato is on the vine, the thicker the skin gets. And during the course of the growing season, as it gets watered, it expands. As it dries out, it contracts. The skin gets tougher. And so it's very difficult to ripen a large tomato around here without the skin being thicker and tougher than you would like it to be. So that then when you slice it, the tomato inside, it can be very yummy and good, but you're going to be gumming on that skin and probably spitting it out after a while. And there's not much you can do about that. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So that's days to ripen. Look for days less than 75, and you will have more luck than with days more than 75. And then there's some of them will say indeterminate, and some of them will say determinate on them. Indeterminate, I think of as unknown. And what they're talking about is the growth habit. Unknown in the sense that it just keeps growing. Indeterminate. Determinate means it grows to a, let's call it a determined size. It means that the tomato naturally branches, fruits at the ends of the branches, and then those branches stop. And they tend to be bush-style tomatoes, originally developed so that you could grow paste tomatoes in the Central Valley of California and go through with a mechanical picker and pick them that way. But then some of that characteristic was developed in tomatoes that are better for eating. And so you will get Bush Early Girl or Bush Champion or various tomatoes that have the word bush in them, means they're a determinate tomato. They're good for smaller containers or for a shorter season. If you don't really care whether they go on till October, you can get a big batch of tomatoes all at once, especially if you want to process them in some way, make sauce, salsa, freeze it. They're a good choice for that. There are also tomatoes that have a tomato leaf and tomatoes that have a potato leaf. This is a very typical tomato leaf. You can see it has lots of little leaflets, and they even have leaflets on the leaflets. And a potato leaf, and this happens to be Visitation Valley. The tomato leaf example here was Sweet Million. But Visitation Valley has more of a potato leaf, and you can see that it has much fewer crenellations in it. And if you were to put it next to a potato plant, it would look pretty similar. Other than that look. There is no significance to the way the leaf grows. It's just that some varieties have a potato leaf and some have a tomato leaf. Brandywine is a famous tomato that has a potato leaf. And most of them have the tomato leaf. Heirloom is a concept that we all have heard and most of us don't quite understand. Heirloom means that a tomato is, number one, more than 50 years old, the variety, and two, that it's open pollinated. And that means, consequently, that it's not a hybrid, because hybrids cannot be open pollinated. They lose their hybrid qualities if they're open pollinated. And it means that they've been around a long time. Sometimes you'll see the term modern hybrid, modern heirloom. I don't know what that means. If it's an heirloom, it depends on people's definitions, but if it's an heirloom, it's a variety that's been around before your grandparents. And it has been maintained by growing it and collecting the seeds and growing it again. I have seen this year, for the first time, some tomatoes that are labeled marriage heirloom marriage. And they're new this year to me anyway. And what they are is hybrid tomatoes where they've taken two heirlooms, let's say Black Crim and Visitation Valley, and they crossed them to make a hybrid, which is fine. I'm not anti-hybrid, but I am against using the word heirloom in a confusing way. And I think that's confusing to say heirloom marriage. It sounds like an heirloom tomato when clearly it isn't. It's a new tomato made by crossing two old tomatoes, and we will see over time whether people like them or not. I'll get a few in eventually here, and we'll test them out. But I do think it's confusing. Open pollinated means that the plants are free to pollinate themselves, and tomatoes are self-pollinating. They don't really even need bees to help them, although probably you get a little more fruit if you've got some bee activity. But they pollinate themselves just fine. And open pollination means they're allowed to do that, and nobody's coming along with a little paintbrush to take pollen from this plant and put it onto that plant. And a hybrid is a combination of two particular tomatoes where somebody has actually done that, or nature has done it, but more often it's because people have taken pollen from one plant, put it on another, grown out the plants that result, like the cross, like the result, and so they do that each season to make new ones of that named hybrid. And hybrids have some qualities that are quite stunning. Hybrid vigor is a real thing. Hybrids can have more vigor than either of their parents. Nobody really knows why. They can be bred for disease resistant. In other words, this tomato tastes really good, but this one is more disease resistant. I'm going to cross them and try to get a tomato that both tastes good and is disease resistant. Nothing wrong with that. And by the way, this has nothing to do with GMO. These are not genetically modified plants. A hybrid is simply taking two tomatoes, and hybrid's not even the right word for it in a sense, because they're all the same species. They're hybrids the same way my children are hybrids. My children are the product of two people. Hybrid tomatoes are the product of two different tomatoes, looking for a particular objective. Now, sometimes that's a problem, because if your objective is met, you might accidentally get rid of some characteristics that are really good. One of those is flavor, and you may have read about the fact that the flavor gene was lost in a lot of tomatoes and only recently rediscovered, so that they could try to put it back into some of the tomatoes that were popular with the farmers because they're easy to grow and easy to harvest, but they had lost their flavor. It wasn't just that they came from miles away that made the supermarket tomatoes flavorless. It was the loss of the gene that made the flavor. So you got to be careful what you're doing. I heard a story on the radio this morning about a cross between domestic pigs and European wild boars up in Canada to get more hardy pigs up in Canada. And now they're calling them super pigs, and they're eating everything in sight, and they've broken out of their pens, and oh my God. So, you got to be careful about what you do. Okay, organic or conventional. Organic means certified organic by one of the organizations that does that, whether it's the Department of Agriculture, the federal department, or the state Department of Agriculture, or there are even private organizations that can put their seal of approval. And what it means is they have checked the ingredients that went into growing the tomatoes, and they're certifying that they've been done in what has become known as an organic manner. That means fertilizers that are more or less natural. It means no derived chemicals used. Doesn't mean that they never spray them for bugs. They can use oils, they can use soaps, but DDT would never be on the approved list. Of course, it isn't approved anywhere anymore. So organic means also a style of farming, which I think is wonderful, where you care for the soil, and instead of plowing tons of chemical fertilizers into the soil and depleting the soil, you build up the soil with natural organic matter and manures to grow the crops that you're growing. So I think organic's a good thing. Conventional means not organic. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that it's been madly sprayed with all kinds of horrible things, but it means that it's not certified organic. And then you'll see things like V or F or TM sometimes on the labels. And V means verticillium, F means fusarium. Those are both fungus wilt diseases, and it means the plants are resistant to them. TM is tobacco mosaic, and it means the plant is resistant to tobacco mosaic. And mostly that'll be, or exclusively that'll be on hybrid plants. And then there's the word sucker, and that can apply to a lot of different things, but in this context, a sucker means, these are so young that we don't have much in the way of suckers here. Okay. In each leaf axil, this is a leaf axil, this is a former leaf axil where the leaf got removed, there's a branch growing out. And a sucker in this context is no more than a branch. And every leaf axil will have a branch growing out of it. Another gardening use of the term sucker is for root suckers that grow up out of the soil, especially on fruit trees. But in the tomato context, that doesn't happen. So when somebody talks about suckers, they're talking about the branches that grow out from leaf axils. And the reason I bring it up is there is a certain amount of literature that suggests that suckers should be removed. And I don't subscribe to that. Some I've seen it written that one should remove suckers below the first flowers. Now, the first flowers on this plant are just teeny tiny buds right now. They're right there on top. And they're going to open up and be yellow flowers and then eventually tomatoes. And so the suckers below those would be all of these and this one and anything else that grows out below those first flowers. I see absolutely no reason to do that. I think the thinking is, oh, that sucks the energy out of the flowers if the plant is putting energy into growing leaves. Well, hate to tell you, whoever the writer is, but the only way the plant can make enough proteins, sugars, and fats to grow the tomatoes is by making more leaves. And the only place that is going to make more leaves is below the first flowers. And so if you remove those suckers, the plant is then going to have to find a new bud, probably in the same location, and send out a new branch so that it can make more leaves, more branches, and more flowers. So the only time that I remove suckers from tomatoes is if I think it's getting too congested in the middle. Then I might remove one to open it up so there's more light and air. Or if the plant's just getting too big and unwieldy, I might remove an entire arm that's come out. But otherwise, I want my plants to be as big and vigorous and to make as many leaves as they possibly can. There'll be a caveat there because I don't want it to make only leaves. I want it to make leaves and flowers and fruit. So I leave the suckers in place. Up to you. If you talk to 100 different experienced gardeners and ask them how to grow tomatoes, you'll get 100 different answers. So I realize this is one person's opinion that I'm passing along to you. And don't be afraid to experiment with other ways of doing things, because I'm a believer in lots of different ways leading to successes. Now, what do tomatoes like? They like at least 6 hours of sun during the middle of the day. That means between 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock. The sun before 10 o'clock is not very strong. The sun after 4 o'clock is not very strong. So if all you can give a tomato is the morning sun between 6 a.m. and noon, that's 6 hours of sun, but it's only 2 hours of really good sun. And the same analysis goes for the afternoon, although it's a little better in the afternoon because at least it's warmer and the sun's a little stronger in the afternoon, especially with daylight saving time. But try to get them in the sunniest location that you have. They also need decent drainage. Doesn't have to be perfect. I once made the mistake of growing a tomato it was an experiment. I grew it in a bag of potting soil. That wasn't the mistake. I wanted to just put it in the potting soil and see how it grew. I did it in 3 or 4 different kinds of potting soil. And I just wanted to see what effect the different potting soils had. But in one of them, I forgot to punch holes in the bottom of the bag for drainage. And so at one point I walked by and it smelled really bad. And I went, what's going on here? And realized that it was sitting in water and potting soil. But it was growing just fine, just like the other tomatoes were. So I quick punched holes in it and the water came out and it was really smelling. But that tomato did fine. So I think at least in the early stages of their development, say the first 4 to 6 weeks, if the drainage isn't terrific, they'll still be okay. I wouldn't expect it to survive the whole season that way. And I think eventually it would get root rot probably and die. But it was an interesting thing to learn that they could survive in some water like that. As far as I know, there are no varieties of tomatoes that tolerate really soggy conditions better than others. And there are tomatoes that are grafted. This is an example of a grafted early girl. They are grafted onto a rootstock, just like a fruit tree is grafted onto a rootstock. And it's probably almost impossible to see, but right here, there's a little scar. And what they did was grow the tomato that they were going to use as a rootstock and then snip it off. And they grew the tomato that is the early girl that was going to go on top of the rootstock, and then cut that off and joined them together. And they grew together. And so this is an early girl, genetically, an early girl tomato growing on a rootstock whose name I don't know. And the rootstock is designed to be more vigorous, more disease resistant, more hot and cold tolerant than most of the rootstocks that the seedlings would naturally develop. I think that's proof that they've been around now for a number of years, and they've proved themselves pretty well. They're quite a bit more expensive. Here they're $15 as opposed to $5. But in particular for a larger tomato, like a black crim, or this is a Cherokee purple, if you have wanted to grow one of the bigger, longer ripening tomatoes and have had difficulty doing it, then I would recommend you try a grafted one and see if it doesn't work better for you. Over the length of the season, the grafted rootstock probably will make a better plant for you over time. And people who have been buying the larger ones that way have been coming back and getting them again the next season. So I think there's been pretty good success there. I personally, I haven't done it. So I can't give you a personal experience. So 6 hours of sun minimum, middle of the day if possible, decent drainage, fertile soil. What does that mean? It means soil with plenty of organic matter in it and some organic matter that provides some nitrogen is helpful. That's basically manures. Compost, leafy compost provides humus and improves the texture of the soil and micronutrients, but not much in the way of the big three, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Those are the three big numbers that are on any fertilizer has a guaranteed analysis. So this down-to-earth BioLive is 5%. Does it say it on the front? Mm-hmm. Does? Mm-hmm. Where is it? Oh yeah, right there. 5% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, 2% potash. And any fertilizer that calls itself a fertilizer will have to have a guaranteed analysis like that. Compost is not considered a fertilizer, won't have an analysis. You really won't know what it is, but it's added to soil to improve texture, water retention, aeration, and slowly decompose, giving humic acids, which improve clay soils and sandy soils, both. And then manures, chicken manure and steer manure are readily available, add quite a bit of nitrogen, a little bit of phosphorus and potash. And then a balanced I like a balanced organic fertilizer. They're derived from things like blood meal, bone meal, bat guano, feather meal, and they give sustained feeding over a period of time, and don't wash away and go down the drain into the rivers and streams and the bay and the ocean. So I do highly recommend organic fertilizers as opposed to the higher concentrations in chemical fertilizers. You might see 16, 16, 16 in a chemical fertilizer, which means you're getting more of all those nutrients for your dollar, but they're not going to last very long, and most of it's going to be wasted because you almost can't help but over fertilize, and then it just goes away into the waters.
You like earthworm castings too, right?
Earthworm castings are wonderful for improving the texture of soils. Again, there's no analysis on them. I'm sure they undoubtedly have some nitrogen in them, but they're mainly for improving texture. And especially in clay soils, they do a fantastic job. Gypsum is good also for clay soils, but earthworm castings do a great job of taking the tiny little clay particles, and the word is agglomerating them, glopping them together into bigger particles, not that big, but they're still tiny, but that allows water and air to pass in between the particles, which is the problem with clay soil, is that nothing can move basically in it. It's full of water and squeezes out all the air, and then the roots can't breathe. The leaves require carbon dioxide to breathe in, and they give off oxygen. The roots, on the other hand, have to breathe in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. So oxygen from the air has to be able to get down to the soil for the roots to breathe. Now, what's special about the Bay Area for tomatoes? Well, our cold nights are the main thing that are special in the Bay Area. The very thing that gives us our natural air conditioner and makes us not sweltering at night the way the Central Valley is, makes the nights a little too cool for tomatoes in the best of times. My sister down in Marina del Rey near Los Angeles has nights in the 60s. The tomatoes love it there. In Portland, Oregon, they have warmer nights than we have. Being so close to the ocean and the bay, every night that cool marine layer comes in, and anytime the temperature is below about 55 for a tomato, the whole system just shuts down. The ripening system that's adding sugars into the fruit stops. And until the temperature gets back up in the morning, past 55, it doesn't start up again. And so that's why your 70-day tomato is going to be 80 or 85 days, because there's almost not a night anywhere in the Bay Area that isn't under 55 degrees, even in the middle of summer. So that's a problem. And as a result, we have to do a few things to give the tomatoes a head start. I like to get tomatoes at this stage when they're available. And they're starting to be available now. As Shannon says, they're coming in. I have to admit, I've been a little bit slow in bringing the tomatoes in here at our store because it's been so cold, and it's still raining, and they're just not happy out there. They're being grown undercover by the wholesale growers that grow them.
And then they come here and we have to kind of stick them out in the open. And some of them get unhappy. So keep your, as the weather is still cold, when you go shopping, look at them carefully. If they have a lot of black blotchy spots on the leaves, stay away from them. They should be nice and green and healthy looking. I did bring one here that has a little bit of question on it that may be starting to go bad. And I don't know how well you can see that, but you can see the kind of black spotty stuff starting to grow on that leaf. And that may be a fungal leaf spot. So unfortunately for this particular Cherokee purple, he's not going to be able to go back and live with his friends. He's going to have to be quarantined until we see what's going on with him. But look things over carefully, because with this cold weather, there's a lot of possibilities for iffy stuff going on with the tomatoes. And as the weather normalizes, as it's supposed to over the next couple of weeks, the rain stops, they'll be happier, and the ones that are coming in will be nice and fresh. And we can keep planting tomatoes well into June around here and still have plenty of time to have fruit, because we have such a nice extended summer and fall. We don't have to worry about, in September, the snow starts or things like that. And so we can have tomatoes that just keep going. And so it doesn't hurt to baby them along a little bit early in the season, because you're going to have plenty of time later on. So what I like to do is take, this is a kind of a big start. You can see the difference between this one and this one. They're both perfectly healthy, and I wouldn't be afraid to start either one of them, but I'm going to take the big one because it's easier to see what's going on. This is a Petaluma Hill Purple. It's a wonderful variety, a medium to small size slicer with dark shoulders and really good flavor. It's about a 75-day tomato. And I'm going to just pop it out of its pot here. No, well, there we go. Give it a good knock. And you can see it's got really good roots. So this baby is ready to go into something bigger. Now that something bigger is not the ground at this point. The ground is too cold to be planting a tomato in. Your soil is probably well under 50 degrees, and it will be for a while, but a tomato that's been grown a little bit prior to putting it into the ground is going to do much better than this little tiny guy going right into the cold ground. So what I like to do, thank you, Jen. I like to put them in a 1-gallon container. Black plastic is wonderful because it absorbs heat from the sun and warms up the soil. And this size is really perfect to grow them for several weeks to a month in before I put them in the ground or in a big pot where they might ultimately grow. If I put it in a pot big enough to grow it all season, it's almost like putting it in the ground. The soil's not going to warm up during the day, and it's not going to grow very much until things warm up. These 3 pots that I have here are about what we would, in the trade, we would call them 15-gallon pots. They're probably not actually that big, but they all are about 2 cubic feet in volume, and they would take 1 big sized bag of potting soil to fill them up. And they're a good size for growing a tomato for the whole season. Anything smaller is probably not going to sustain it for the whole season. But it will still give you lots of tomatoes. But this is a good size, but not to start out here in cold April. So instead, we're gonna start it out in a 1 gallon size container. If things remain cold after a couple of weeks, I might move it into a 2 gallon container. And grow it for a little longer even. And let's see, I think I have right here next to me a bag of Sloat organic potting soil, which is my choice of I would call it a premium potting soil without the premium price. The potting soils that are premium and have the premium price would include things like the Fox Farm Ocean Forest, and the Sloat sells the EB Stone Formula 420 or Recipe 420. Those are both premium potting soils with premium prices. But I think the Sloat organic potting soil plus a live fertilizer, which means it has mycorrhizal fungi and some bacteria added to it, gives you just about the same thing at a better price. So there we have it. So using this as a thing to make things bigger, there are 3 tools that every gardener needs to have if they don't have any others. One of them is a trowel. And here's a nice shiny new trowel. I'm not going to use the new one. They need a pair of gloves, shiny new pair of gloves, and they need a pair of clippers. I have these. This is a brand new pair of Felcos, very nice. With those 3 tools, you can do just about anything in the garden. And I recommend you put the gloves on. I don't always do as I preach, but it's more than just keeping your hands clean. It's protecting yourself from things that are in the soil that you don't want to ingest, basically. And we've been talking about things like animal manures. They're great for the garden, but you don't want to be eating them. I was up at the Portland Zoo recently, and at the petting zoo part of it, they now have a big outdoor hand washing station so that you can wash your hands after you pet the animals, and they have signs saying, you don't really want these animal germs, go wash your hands. Well, that's kind of, gloves are helpful for that. So we have our tomato, and we're going to put a little bit of soil in the pot, and we're going to add a little bit of balanced fertilizer with these mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria. And this one is EB Stone Sure Start, which we generally recommend for almost all plantings. Over here, Jen, is the EB Stone Tomato Vegetable Food. This is the Down to Earth BioLive. These are all real good organic fertilizers. The exact numbers are not critical if they're reasonably balanced. A lot of packaging on fertilizers is marketing. And the fact that it says it's for vegetables doesn't mean you can't use it for something else, or that you can't use something else for your vegetables. So I'm going to use Sure Start because I happen to have this open bag, and I'm not going to open another bag just for kits. Okay, so I'm going to put about a tablespoon of fertilizer in and mix it into the bottom part of the soil here. And then I'm going to check for depth here a little bit, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to tell you why I'm checking for depth and why it looks good. Conventional, no, wrong word, not conventional, non-grafted tomatoes, seedlings, are generally planted deep, meaning the soil level is going to be up here when it's planted. The reason for that is, and I don't know that you can see the tiny little hairs that grow out of the stem, but those are all potential roots. And so what we generally do is pick off the leaves that are going to be underground because there's no reason for them to be there. And then we use our pruning shears, or I love to use the label, but I've
Here.
lost it. Oh, Jen had it. Okay. Didn't lose it.
Sorry.
I love to use the label for this. It's the perfect tool. The corner of the label to scratch up the roots. And I'm doing this for two reasons. One is to cut the pattern that the roots get into of growing around the can or the container that they've been in. And the second reason is that by scratching up the surface of the soil, I'm increasing the surface area that the new soil can connect with. So by making lots of little nooks and crannies, the new soil can feed into the nooks and crannies and make a better attachment. And that's really all I need to do. And then I'm going to plant it so that the new soil will cover up that lower part of the stem. And that way more roots will grow out of the stem and I'll have a better root system. So then I'm going to add a little bit of fertilizer, again, about another tablespoon to the top of the soil here and switch it around. And so that when I put it in, I've got fertilizer in the soil mixture.
Hey, Dan, can I ask a quick question while you're doing that? Somebody
Of course.
asked about coffee grounds, and this is something that we conversate about often. You see it all over the computer, and the Starbucks and Pete's, they all, have these bags of spent coffee grounds that they have available for quote unquote gardeners. Will you speak to the coffee grounds as an amendment right quick?
I'll be happy to. Coffee grounds are okay as an amendment. They're not very acidic because most of the acid has been taken out of them when the coffee's been brewed. They're not very nutritious, but they help soil texture if they're mixed into the soil, or you can put them in your compost, probably even better, and let them compost along with other things. What you do not want to do with coffee grounds is make a layer of coffee grounds on top of your soil or on top of your pot, because they tend to pack down and be impervious to the water when they start to dry out. And the water will just run off of them. And so they don't work well as a mulch. They could be mixed with other things like fairly finely ground bark. And you could mix the coffee grounds in with them. But I think their best use is as a soil amendment or an additive to your compost. Just never put a thick layer of coffee grounds around your plants, because they're going to dry out and the water's just going to run off. So
People ask about eggshells too.
Well, yeah, okay, let's talk about eggshells too. Eggshells are fine in the garden. They're a source of calcium, which we want. But they take years to decompose and to release their calcium. And so don't rely on the eggshells as the only source of calcium for your plants. And we'll talk about calcium some more here in a minute, because they're important for many vegetables. Calcium is important for many vegetables. It's just that unless you could powder the eggshells, grind them into a very fine powder, they're going to take years to become available to the plants. And if they do become available to the plants, it'll be in big chunks. It won't be spread evenly throughout your garden. So I have for years put eggshells in my compost pile. And for years, I find eggshells in my garden, which is fine. I don't mind it. But I know they're going to be for some millennia in the future that they're really doing a lot of good for the plants. Okay, so we now have a little tomato planted in a little can, and it'll be perfectly happy in this for, you know, at least 3 weeks to a month. And it'll grow substantially. And I usually, I always have, and this is the fourth tool, I guess, after a trowel, glove, and clippers, some little bamboo stakes. And number 5, some kind of string or tie of some sort, because I don't like to just leave the tomatoes to grow on their own. I like them to have a little bit of support. To begin with, it doesn't have to be very tall. And the nice thing about these bamboo stakes is they're easy to cut with the clippers. And then I have to take the gloves off to tie this, because my fingers are fumbly enough as it is. But there is a technique, believe it or not, for tying things to stakes. So I'll show you the technique. It's quite simple. You go around the plant, you make a figure 8 around the stake, and you tie it to the stake. And you don't crank it down really hard. You leave it kind of loose. And you tie a square knot, which those of you who are Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts will know about. And if you don't, you can learn. And then you snip off the excess, and you have a nice little support for the tomato. And the string is soft, it won't scar it, and it's tied loosely enough that it can expand. And it'll, that way, if I happen to trip over the pot as I'm walking along, or whack it with a rake or something like that, I'm less likely to snap the tomato off. Or if my dog wants to sniff it or whatever, she won't break it. So it's a good idea to stake them a little bit. Now, when they get bigger and you're ready to put them in the ground, and I'm going to pretend that this big gray pot here is the ground, you're going to want more than this little stake to support them. And I like to use tomato cages. I'll be right back. If I happen to have the tomato cages right here, I'll show you how they work.
I was gonna show these gloves up close because all of us love these gloves.
Well, the reason we love these gloves is that they're thin enough that you can feel what you're doing, but they're strong enough that they'll protect your hands, and they're inexpensive.
Yep.
So those are 3 good things. Big, heavy leather gloves are great if you're doing, you know, thorny things, but most of us are doing things where we want to be able to feel what we're doing. Now, this is a pretty typical tomato cage, and it's going to sit in the ground or the pot just like this. And it may look huge right now. Tomato would be in here. But if you're going to have any success at all, this is going to seem small after a while. And your tomato is going to be up here and draping over and sticking out the sides and all over the place if you're having real success. The Guinness Book of World Records for a tomato was a sun gold tomato that was growing on an arbor, and it was 40 or 50 feet long.
No kidding.
And just a huge thing. You can look it up. So, you know, tomatoes are indeterminate. Tomatoes are basically vines that would be growing along the ground or kind of winding up trees. And that's what you want, is a big tomato. So this particular style of cage, this is kind of a heavy duty wire cage. That clock isn't working.
Oh,
We started at 10 and it still says 10, it's still 11, so I better move along. There are different styles of cages, but they're all very similar. And you can supplement them or do your own by simply taking stakes and, putting longer stakes than this in, several stakes around the plant, and then winding some string around will support them just fine. And sometimes you need to do that if you forget to put the cage on while the plant is small. You'll end up being very frustrated and probably breaking parts of the plant if you try to squeeze them into the cage after they're already grown. So get your cages in place while the plant is still small, or you're going to be building your own support structure as it grows. You can let them sprawl on the ground. The plant won't really care. But snails and slugs and earwigs and things like that are more likely to get at your fruit. And there are soil-borne diseases that are more likely to get at your plant if you let them sprawl. But lots of commercially grown tomatoes are basically sprawling on the ground. So it's not that it can't be done.
Hey, Dan, can I ask you one other question since we are kind of winding up? There's one I've been hanging on to. And you touched a little bit on, some of the diseases, and, something that we talk about often with tomatoes is that tomato rot. I see you have some Folical and some other goodies there. Just thought, before you fully wrap up, will you speak really quickly to what are some things we can use for diseases that tend to attack tomatoes?
Yes. The most important thing is a balanced fertilizer and some calcium. Any fertilizer that you use for tomatoes should say that it's got at least 3% calcium in it. If it doesn't, you can add calcium. This is oyster shell. It's finely ground and it will be available relatively quickly. The disease, if you will, or process that Shannon was talking about is called blossom end rot. And it's when the end of the tomato, where the blossom was, which is the outside end, not the stem end, turns kind of brown and looks dry and blistered and tan or brown. And that's associated with either a lack of calcium or the plant just not being able to use the calcium that's available. And often it will go away with time. In other words, the first few tomatoes may have it, but later tomatoes will not. But if you want to be sure, the Folical is a liquid calcium spray that you can spray on the plants. It won't hurt them a bit, and probably will give them a shot of calcium that may ensure that you don't have blossom end rot later on in the season. There are also many fungal diseases that attack tomatoes. I mentioned verticillium and fusarium, which are both soil-borne. There's early blight and late blight. There are leaf spot fungal diseases, and the Monterey Complete Disease Control is a fungicide. It's actually a bacteria that acts as a fungicide. It's approved for organic gardening and can help especially if you're seeing spots on the leaves lower down that seem to be moving up the plant. Sometimes you can arrest their development with something like the Monterey Disease Control. And then if you experience the leaves or even the whole chunks of the tomato being eaten, You may have rodents, number one. That's the first thing to check. Rats will eat tomatoes. But you may also have tomato hornworms, which are a very large caterpillar, green, which will probably cause you to jump about 10 feet when you see it the first time. But they will eat the whole bottom out of the tomato. And the Bacillus thuringiensis, which is widely available, this is the Monterey version, BT, is another bacterial product that kills caterpillars in particular. And you can use that. Although usually you don't have more than a couple of tomato hornworms, and you can pick them off by hand and get rid of them. They develop, by the way, into the beautiful sphinx moths, and so I'm a little loath to. I've been known to sacrifice a tomato plant to the tomato hornworms in order to have sphinx moths around. Okay, let me see what else here is on my little lista that I don't want to miss.
How often
Now,
to water?
The blights are something that the late blight is the same thing that caused the potato famine in Ireland. There's really nothing you can do about it. If your tomatoes start to turn brown and crispy at the mid to late season, just pull them up and get rid of them and put them in your green compost can. Don't try to compost them yourself. They might have late blight. Early blight is not as serious usually, and we don't have as much of it around here. The main thing is to clean up the area after you've grown the tomatoes. Don't let them rot in place, either the fruit or the plants. Make sure that you have adequate spacing so you have plenty of air circulation between the plants. And look at the plants often. If you've got problems with them, take pictures, bring some of the leaves into your local garden center, try to get a diagnosis. Some things the plant can just live with, and some things are important to take care of, either by getting rid of the plant or by using a fungicide. So most people grow tomatoes just fine, and the tomato plants can live with a certain amount of disease, excuse me, but some of them can be overwhelmed as well. Insect-wise, there aren't that many problems with insects with tomatoes, which is kind of nice. They don't get aphids usually. They can get insects that will eat the fruit if it's on the ground, but usually not in the air, other than the tomato hornworm, which are insect larvae. If you fertilize regularly with the balanced fertilizer, that means about every 2 weeks in a container, about once a month on the ground. You'll keep them growing nicely, and they don't like to get bone dry. So water them deeply about once a week, once they're established for a month or so, and that should be adequate in the ground. In a container, probably every other day for the water. Now, for those of you who are still here, and I know I'm long-winded here, but cherry tomatoes will always be successful in the Bay Area. So that's things like Sun Gold, Sweet Millions, Super Sweet 100, Matt's Wild Cherry. There are lots of them, and they'll all do just fine. Juliet is one of my favorites. The medium-sized slicers will almost always do well. So that's things like San Francisco Fog, Petaluma Hill Purple, Visitation Valley, Moskvich, Stupice, they'll all do wonderfully for almost any area in the Bay Area. And then you start getting into larger, longer season tomatoes. Those are going to be more successful over in Contra Costa County, where you're a little farther away from the marine influence. And so then you start getting into Paul Robeson and Black Crim and Cherokee Purple and Brandywine and Lemon Boy, and there are just lots of nice varieties, but grow some of the smaller ones too, because even in Contra Costa, and it'll warm up a little quicker. But the tomatoes are going to stop their ripening process in the coldest part of the night and going to have to start up again. I say grow a variety of tomatoes, because some varieties will do better for you than others, and keep track of what you grow. If you have good success with one, you might want to get it again next year and not have to come to the nursery and say, oh, I had this great tomato. It was red and about this big. Okay, well, I can give that's about that big, but I don't know if it's the same one or not. So, keep track. Write it down somewhere, take a picture of the label, do something so that you know. And likewise, if you have really poor luck with one, you might want to say, well, I'll try a different your local garden center, whether that's a Sloat or another one, should have the best information for you about people's success or failures with a given variety, that particular area. And it really, your microclimate is your microclimate. And here in Mill Valley, we're foggy all through July and August, but there are many parts of the Bay Area that aren't. I live right over on the other side of Mount Tamalpais in Fairfax, and we're sunny during the day when it's foggy over here in Mill Valley. I can grow tomatoes just fine, and in fact, it gets too hot in places in my yard, and I have to grow them in the cooler spots. Join me next month, May the 6th, I think it is.
Yes.
Peppers, and which I like just as well as tomatoes, if not even better. And we'll go through the ins and outs of pepper growing. And Shannon, do you have any other questions to ask?
I don't have any other questions. There's a couple things I wanted to just add, and hopefully you can confirm. I answered a couple questions about like companion planting, things like, adding basil, or, what kind of flowers will help with, pest deterrence. I mentioned nasturtiums and marigolds. And is there anything that you want to add to that I may have missed?
There's nothing you can plant that will be bad for the tomatoes. Flowers are always good for bringing in beneficial insects, which will help keep bad insects at a dull roar. There's been lots of research about alyssum that shows that it brings in as many good insects as just about any flower that exists. And it's extremely easy to grow.
Yeah.
I would say marigolds and alyssum for the summer are a great addition to the garden, as well as try some native flowers as